In the heart of the 12th century, the Crusader states, born from the fire of the First Crusade, seemed like permanent fixtures in the Holy Land. For nearly 50 years, these Christian outposts, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa had held their ground against a fractured Muslim world. The initial shock of their arrival had faded, replaced by a complex web of alliances, truces, and localized conflicts. The Franks, as the Crusaders were known, had integrated themselves into the landscape, building mighty castles and establishing a new ruling class. But this delicate balance, this era of relative stability, was about to be shattered by the rise of one man, a leader whose ambition would reignite the Holy War and set the stage for one of history's most fascinating and ultimately tragic chapters. This man was Ahmad ad-Din Zengi. He was not just another local emir or warlord. Zengi was a visionary, a ruthless and brilliant military strategist who possessed a singular, burning ambition to unite the bickering Muslim factions of Syria and Mesopotamia under his banner and drive the Franks back into the sea. Appointed as the Turkish Shadab, or governor, of Mosul in 1127 and later seizing Aleppo in 1128, Zengi began the arduous process of consolidation. He was a force of nature, disciplined, feared, and respected. He saw the disunity among his fellow Muslims as the primary reason for the Crusaders' success. While others squabbled over territory and influence, Zengi focused on a larger threat. He methodically expanded his power, bringing city after city under his control, creating a formidable state that stretched across the northern frontier of the Crusader territories. His rise signaled a monumental shift in the political and military dynamics of the Near East. For the first time since the Crusaders arrived, they faced a unified and ideologically driven opponent under a single, formidable commander. Zengi was building an empire, and its ultimate purpose was jihad against the invaders. Of the four Crusader states, the County of Edessa was the most vulnerable. It was the northernmost, the most geographically isolated, and the least populated by Franks. Lying east of the Euphrates River, it was more of a landlocked buffer state than a coastal powerhouse like Jerusalem or Antioch. Its ruler, Count Jocelyn II, was more concerned with the intrigues of his Frankish neighbors than the growing storm on his eastern border. He was an absentee landlord, preferring the comforts of his estates west of the Euphrates to the frontier city of Edessa itself. This neglect proved to be a fatal mistake. Zengi, ever the opportunist, had been watching Edessa for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came in the late autumn of 1144. Count Jocelyn had taken the bulk of his army away from Edessa to intervene in a dispute with another Muslim ruler, leaving the city dangerously exposed. Its garrison was skeletal, its defenses undermanned. Zengi saw his chance and seized it with breathtaking speed. He marched his unified army to the walls of Edessa and laid siege to what was once considered one of the great Christian cities of the East. The remaining defenders and the city's large Armenian Christian population put up a brave but hopeless fight. Without its main army and with no hope of relief from the other Crusader states, who were too far away and perhaps too slow to react, Edessa's fate was sealed. On Christmas Eve of 1144, after a siege of just 4 weeks, Zengi's forces breached the walls. The city fell. The news of the fall of Edessa spread like a shockwave across Christendom. It was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. This wasn't just a castle or a small town that had been lost. It was the first major Crusader state capital to be conquered by Muslim forces. It was a strategic and psychological blow that struck at the very heart of the crusading ideal. The 50 years of success and consolidation were suddenly undone. The work of the First Crusade seemed to be unraveling. For the people of Western Europe, who had come to see the Crusader states as a permanent part of God's plan, the loss was bewildering and terrifying. How could this have happened? The narrative of divine favor that had surrounded the First Crusade was now in question. The fall of Edessa was interpreted not just as a military defeat, but as a sign of God's displeasure, a punishment for the sins of a complacent Christendom. The cry for help from the east reached the ears of Pope Eugene III in Rome. He understood the gravity of the situation immediately. If Edessa could fall, then Antioch and even Jerusalem itself could be next. The very existence of the Holy Land's Christian presence was at stake. In December 1145, just a year after the city's fall, Pope Eugene issued a papal bull, a formal proclamation known as Quantum Predecessors. This document was a powerful and direct call to arms. It invoked the memory of the First Crusade, lamented the fall of Edessa, and called upon the knights and nobles of Europe to take up the cross once more. He offered the same spiritual rewards as his predecessors, the full remission of sins, for those who undertook the journey, known as the Crusader indulgence. This was the official birth of the Second Crusade. But this new crusade would be different from the first. The first crusade had been a chaotic, popular movement, led primarily by powerful nobles, but without the direct command of any reigning monarch. The Second Crusade, by contrast, would be a royal affair. The call to crusade was answered by the two most powerful rulers in Western Europe, King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. This was unprecedented. Never before had reigning kings personally committed to leading a crusade. Louis VII was a young, pious, and deeply devout monarch. He was moved by a profound sense of religious duty, perhaps also seeking to atone for a past military action, where he had burned a church full of people. Taking the cross was, for him, a sacred obligation. He saw the crusade as the ultimate act of penance and devotion. His commitment electrified the French nobility, who eagerly pledged to follow their king to the Holy Land. Meanwhile, in Germany, King Conrad III was initially reluctant. He had pressing domestic issues, including rivalries with other German princes, that demanded his attention. He was a veteran warrior, a more pragmatic and experienced leader than the youthful Louis, and he was wary of embarking on such a distant and perilous adventure. However, the tide of public opinion was turned by the mesmerizing preaching of one of the most influential figures of the 12th century, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was a Cistercian abbot, a theologian, and a charismatic orator whose influence stretched across Europe. Commissioned by the Pope, Bernard embarked on a preaching tour that ignited a firestorm of crusading fervor. His sermons were legendary. At Vézelay in France and later at Speyer in Germany, he moved thousands to tears and to action. When he preached before Conrad III, the king was so moved by Bernard's passionate appeal that he broke down in tears and famously declared, "I am ready to serve him," and took the cross on the spot. The involvement of two major kings gave the Second Crusade immense prestige and resources that the first had lacked. It was to be a grand, organized, royal-led expedition, with the kings of France and Germany at its head, and the blessing of the most famous churchmen in Europe. The crusade seemed destined for success. Vast armies were assembled, logistics were planned, and a wave of optimism swept across the continent. This wasn't going to be a repeat of the chaotic pilgrimage of 1096. This was a meticulously organized military campaign led by the anointed rulers of Christendom. The stage was set for a massive counterattack, a holy war on a scale never before seen. The Christian West was mobilizing its full might to reclaim what was lost and to punish the man who had dared to challenge their presence in the Holy Land. The journey to the East was about to begin, carrying with it the hopes, prayers, and ambitions of an entire continent. The grand armies of the Second Crusade, led by King Conrad III of Germany and King Louis VII of France, set out with high hopes. But their journey across Anatolia quickly turned into a nightmare. Instead of cooperating, they marched separately, a decision that would prove fatal. The Byzantine emperor, wary of these massive Western armies, offered little support. As they entered Seljuk territory, the real trouble began. Both armies suffered from poor planning and a critical lack of supplies. The vast, arid landscapes of Anatolia were unforgiving, and the Crusaders, accustomed to the more fertile lands of Europe, were unprepared for the harsh conditions. Hunger and thirst became constant companions, weakening the soldiers and their resolve. Worse still, they were relentlessly harassed by the highly mobile and skilled Seljuk Turkish horse archers. These were not the pitched battles the Crusaders were used to. Instead, they faced a grueling campaign of attrition. The Seljuks would strike quickly, inflict casualties, disrupt supply lines, and then vanish back into the landscape, avoiding a direct confrontation where the Crusaders' heavy cavalry might have had an advantage. For the German army under Conrad III, this culminated in a devastating encounter near Dorylaeum in October 1147. This was the same area where the First Crusade had won a major victory, but this time, the outcome was tragically different. Exhausted, starving, and strung out on the march, Conrad's army was ambushed by the Seljuks. The Germans were caught completely off guard and were systematically cut to pieces. The battle was a massacre. The vast majority of Conrad's force was annihilated, and Conrad himself was wounded. The proud German army was effectively destroyed. Before it even had a chance to fight in the Holy Land, a small, battered remnant, including the king, managed to retreat and eventually join up with the French. Louis VII's French army fared little better. Though they learned from some of the Germans' mistakes, they just suffered immense losses from constant Seljuk attacks and the brutal conditions of the march. By the time they limped into the Crusader states, they were a shadow of the magnificent force that had left France. The grand overland expedition, intended to bring overwhelming force to the Holy Land, had been a strategic catastrophe, draining the crusade of its best fighting men, resources, and morale before the main campaign had even begun. After the harrowing journey across Anatolia, the battered remnants of the European armies finally gathered with the local Crusader nobility in the city of Acre in June of 1148. This meeting, known as the Council of Acre, was a pivotal moment. High-ranking figures were present, including the two visiting kings, Conrad and Louis, as well as Queen Melisende of Jerusalem and the young King Baldwin III. The original purpose of the entire crusade, the very reason it had been called, was to recapture the city of Edessa from Zengi's successor, Nur al-Din. This was the strategic imperative, the goal that had fired the imagination of Europe. However, at the council, a fateful and baffling decision was made. The leaders, perhaps seeking a more glorious and immediate victory to justify their disastrous march, or perhaps influenced by the local politics of the Crusader states, abandoned the goal of retaking Edessa. Instead, they set their sights on a completely different target, the city of Damascus. Damascus was a major prize. It was a wealthy, culturally significant, and strategically vital city in Syria. Crucially, at that time, Damascus was ruled by an independent dynasty and was actually an occasional ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem against the rising power of Nur al-Din. Attacking it was not just a change of plans, it was a complete reversal of regional strategy. Why did they make this choice? The reasoning remains debated by historians. Some suggest the European kings were swayed by the prospect of conquering a rich city for themselves. Others believe the Jerusalem nobility saw Damascus as a greater long-term threat than the more distant Nur al-Din. Whatever the reason, the decision to attack a potential ally instead of the primary enemy was a monumental strategic blunder. It alienated the one major Muslim power in the region that had been a useful buffer against the aggressive Zengids. The council, intended to unify the Crusader effort, instead set the stage for its ultimate failure, redirecting the crusade from its stated mission toward a gamble that would have disastrous consequences. The choice to attack Damascus was a fatal miscalculation, one that would seal the fate of the entire expedition. With the controversial decision made at the Council of Acre, the combined Crusader forces marched on Damascus. This was to be the main event, the grand military action of the Second Crusade. In late July 1148, they arrived and began the siege. Initially, they had some success. They attacked from the west, where the city was surrounded by dense orchards and gardens. These orchards provided the Crusaders with food and water and seemed to be the most vulnerable approach to the city's walls. For a couple of days, there was fierce fighting amongst the trees as the Damascene defenders fought desperately to hold the Crusaders back. However, the attack was plagued by problems from the very beginning. The command structure was a mess. There was no single, decisive leader. King Louis VII, King Conrad III, and King Baldwin III of Jerusalem all had Jihad's own ideas and ambitions. This lack of unified command led to poor coordination and constant bickering. The European kings, new to the region, often clashed with the local Crusader barons, who had a better understanding of the local terrain and politics. The local lords accused the newcomers of arrogance and ignorance, while the European kings suspected the barons of having ulterior motives. This internal squabbling paralyzed their decision-making process. Then came the critical error. Based on what was likely bad advice, the Crusader leaders decided to abandon their position in the western orchards and move their army to the eastern side of the city. The eastern plain was barren and exposed, with less access to water and no cover from the defenders on the walls. It was a much stronger, less vulnerable side of the city to attack. Why they made this move is still a mystery. Some sources claim the local barons were bribed, while others suggest it was simply a catastrophically poor tactical decision. The move demoralized the army and exposed them to the full force of the Damascene defenses. As the Crusaders struggled on the exposed eastern plain, word arrived that Nur al-Din was marching with a large army to relieve the city. Faced with a unified and determined enemy, a deteriorating supply situation, and an imminent arrival of reinforcements, the Crusader leaders lost their nerve. After only 4 days, the siege was shamefully abandoned. The great army simply packed up and retreated. The failed siege of Damascus was an unmitigated disaster. It was a military humiliation of the highest order and represented the complete An utter failure of the Second Crusade. They had achieved nothing, alienated a former ally, and left their reputation in tatters. The failure of the Second Crusade didn't just end in a quiet retreat. It sent shockwaves across Europe and the Middle East, fundamentally altering the political landscape for decades to come. Back in Europe, the prestige of the monarchs who led the charge, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, was left in tatters. This grand, holy endeavor, blessed by the Pope himself, had ended in a humiliating and costly failure. The fallout from this was immense. Imagine the difficulty of trying to convince nobles and commoners to join another crusade. The trust was gone. People had sacrificed wealth, time, and their very lives for what turned out to be a poorly managed disaster. This erosion of confidence made organizing future large-scale expeditions significantly more challenging. The reputation of crusading as a guaranteed path to glory and divine favor was deeply tarnished. Even more damaging were the consequences in the Crusader states themselves. The decision to attack Damascus, a city that had previously been a somewhat reluctant but stable ally against the more aggressive Zengi, was a catastrophic strategic blunder. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had been the primary advocate for this attack, had burned its most important bridge. The ruling dynasty of Damascus, feeling betrayed and now deeply hostile, had no choice but to look for a new, powerful protector. They didn't have to look far. The natural choice was Nur ad-Din, the son of their old enemy, Zengi. By attacking their own potential ally, the Crusaders had effectively pushed Damascus straight into the arms of their greatest threat. This single act of political short-sightedness created a new, far more dangerous reality for the Crusader states. The fragile balance of power they had relied on for survival was shattered, and they were now more isolated and vulnerable than ever before. The repercussions of this strategic failure were immediate and profound. The alliance between Damascus and Nur ad-Din wasn't just a minor shift in loyalties. It was the catalyst for the unification of the Islamic world in the Levant. Before the Crusade, the Muslim powers in the region were fractured. You had the Zengids in Aleppo and Mosul, the Burids in Damascus, and the Fatimids in Egypt, each with their own agendas. This disunity was the single greatest advantage the Crusader states possessed. They could play one power against another, forging temporary alliances to ensure their own survival. But the failed siege of Damascus changed everything. It allowed Nur ad-Din to march into the city, not as a conqueror, but as a celebrated protector. By 1154, he had solidified his control over both Aleppo and Damascus, effectively merging the two most significant Syrian cities under his single, unified rule. This was the nightmare scenario. For the Franks, a single, powerful, and hostile Sunni state now bordered their territories to the north and east. Nur ad-Din was a pious, charismatic, and militarily brilliant leader. He was driven by a powerful vision of jihad, not just for personal gain, but to push the Crusaders out of the Levant entirely. The unification of Syria under his banner created a formidable and cohesive military force that the fragmented Crusader states simply could not match on their own. The buffer zones were gone. The potential for playing diplomatic games had vanished. Now, they faced a monolithic enemy, united in purpose and led by a man determined to see their downfall. The Crusaders' own actions had inadvertently created the very unified Muslim front they had always feared the most, setting the stage for a new and far more dangerous chapter in their struggle for survival. With Syria united under his control, Nur ad-Din became the undisputed, dominant threat to the Crusader states. His focus was relentless. He continued to consolidate his power, launching campaigns that chipped away at Crusader territories and tightened the noose around their kingdoms. But his strategic vision extended beyond Syria. He understood that to truly defeat the Franks, he needed to control the vast wealth and resources of Egypt. At the time, Egypt was ruled by the weakening Shia Fatimid Caliphate, which was plagued by internal strife and political instability. Seeing an opportunity, Nur ad-Din sent his most trusted general to intervene in the chaotic Egyptian power struggles. That general's name was Shirkuh, and accompanying him was his young, ambitious nephew. This nephew was none other than Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. The campaigns in Egypt were complex and drawn out, but they were ultimately successful. Following his uncle's death, Saladin managed to outmaneuver his rivals and establish himself as the effective ruler of Egypt in 1169, technically still under the authority of Nur ad-Din. The consolidation of power was complete. The Crusader states were now surrounded, caught in a pincer between Nur ad-Din's forces in Syria to the north and east, and Saladin's forces in Egypt to the south. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved to seize his legacy, eventually taking control of Damascus and uniting Egypt and most of Syria under his own personal rule. The failure of the Second Crusade to take Damascus had not only led to a unified Syria under Nur ad-Din, but it had also directly created the conditions for the rise of his even more famous successor. It was Saladin, forged in the crucible of Nur ad-Din's campaigns, who would go on to fulfill the ultimate goal of recapturing the holy city of Jerusalem in 1187, a monumental event that would directly trigger the Third Crusade and bring him face to face with Richard the Lionheart.